Richmond had learned to dress its ruins. In the spring of 1865, the city knotted pride with velvet ribbons, borrowed chandeliers, and careful phrases about endurance. The Harper mansion joined the performance. Servants scoured soot from marble, cracked mirrors were tilted to catch only flattering angles, and the front steps were powdered with chalk to hide fire stains left by soldiers. On the announced night of charity, the hall blazed like a lantern raised against want. Grace Harper entered as the music rose, a dark blue satin catching light like river water. She walked the old house as one who knew every joint in the floor. Guests lifted their fans and their gazes. A wounded city still remembered whose name had once paid its debts. She was Jonathan Harper's eldest, taught to balance ledgers and tempers, and the hush that followed her arrival recognized that authority. Even Emily, prettily reckless in pearl-colored silk, tilted her head with the measuring poise of someone who had rehearsed a script about piety. The speeches began. A rector praised self-denial. A colonel's widow described rationed flour as a patriotic sacrament. Grace felt the room's frail kindness, the wish to believe in her steadiness and the estate's recovery. Then Emily advanced with the family guardian's banker, Nathaniel Prowse, and their aunt-in-law, Mrs. Selden Hands, cupped around a sheaf of papers that seemed to glow in the lamplight. They summoned silence with the charitable gravity of a donation plate. "Revisions," Emily announced. Prowse unfolded the supposed testament of Jonathan Harper and read in a voice trained to sound reluctant. He listed improprieties: a misplaced order for coffee beans, a missing chest of flatware, an overgenerous coal account, all chalked under Grace's name. Mrs. Selden dabbed her eyes and declared that the late master had desired his prudent younger daughter and the guardians to manage the estate until Grace demonstrated a steadiness she sadly lacked. Grace felt the room tilt. She knew those accounts. A shipment her father had approved, silver loaned to the notary for safekeeping, coal diverted by a ward captain who saluted Emily in doorways. She opened her mouth to answer, but the stage had been built to swallow replies. A young clerk produced ledgers stamped with red wax, guests bent to read, and their pity forgot to consult memory. The papers lay like open verdicts. Someone whispered prodigal, and the word travelled faster than reason. Her fiancé, Thomas Reedson, of a shipping agent, newly returned from Danville, bowed not to her but to the guardians. He murmured about responsibilities, thanked Prowse with the solemnity of a man rescued from imprudence, and withdrew his hand from Grace's. It was done with elegance, like extinguishing a candle before an open window. When he relinquished her fingers, the air at her bare knuckles felt like the first draught in an emptied church. The remainder of the ball became a demonstration. A tray of subscription cards was placed near Emily. She wrote handsome gifts in the family's name, each pledge intoned as the fruit of reallocated stewardship. When Grace stepped forward to correct a figure, a volunteer gently urged her away, as though she were an overwrought guest troubling the arithmetic of goodness. Women who had once borrowed her shawls watched like parishioners in a gallery of moral instruction. The guardians signed receipts that seemed to bless the new order, and the rector prayed that discipline might heal the city. By midnight, the revised will had gathered the authority that clings to spectacle. Grace stood inside her father's house and felt the floorboards memorize her helplessness. The last waltz resumed. Partners danced not to music, but to the promise that sternness would redeem the city. When she retreated to the corridor to breathe, she found the study door locked and the small iron ring of keys missing from its peg. Only her name remained, travelling among the guests like a stain that could not be laundered. The next morning, and every morning for weeks, the punishments learned their routines. At church, the sexton met her at the nave and, with a blush that apologized for itself, directed her to a bench behind a pillar where servants sat. The Harper pew, polished by her father's gloves for 20 years, bore Emily's bonnet and Mrs. Selden's prayer book. There was no room for the daughter who had balanced accounts through winter. The hymn rose without her. At noon, the kitchen bell called. She was instructed to carry dishes into the dining room and then withdraw before the blessing. If gravy spotted her cuff, a maid remarked that ladies' fabric did not belong among kettles. If a dish cooled, she heard that careless fingers ruined charity. The housemaids, ordered to report, watched with the embarrassment of people paid to unlearn their loyalties. In the afternoons, she was assigned to sort letters for Emily's relief drives, but her own correspondence arrived opened or vanished altogether. Each intrusion wore the lace cuff of propriety. Her father's study remained sealed. The desk drawers that had once surrendered their secrets to her touch were now itemized by Mrs. Selden, who kept the key at her belt and spoke softly about the instructions in your father's will. Ledgers were carried from the shelves to a sideboard in the parlor, where Emily liked to sit in view of callers, head bent over figures, while her plumes nodded approval at herself. Arithmetic, performed theatrically, became a sacrament the city understood. Debts multiplied under Grace's name as if numbers bred when watched by enemies. A coachman was paid to remember that she had ordered unrecorded deliveries. A grocer produced a crimson notebook in which he had been persuaded to write her initials beside flour and spices she had never tasted. The banker certified these fictions with a fatherly regret that made contradiction indecent. The mechanism was tidy. Accuse a woman of imbalance, and the city will confiscate her balance to cure it. Neighbors were encouraged to visit. They came with pies and questions, stepping lightly across rugs as if walking on a scandalized conscience. Emily received them near the library door and explained with practiced shyness that she had moved her sister out of harm's way by taking custody of accounts and rooms. Grace's chamber key disappeared. The bolt on the small trunk where she kept her mother's letters was discovered broken, though the break bore the gentlemanly neatness of a pocket knife. Every theft leaned upon a tender word. By the second week, the mansion had become a school for moral theatre. Emily staged a pantry inventory with invited neighbors, tapping jars and listing shortages caused by confusion. She forced a smile at Grace across the ledger and noted a temporary reassignment of duties. That afternoon, a minister's wife asked Grace to bring hot water, as if the new courtesy required rehearsing her diminished station. Even the pianoforte participated. When Grace began a nocturne, Mrs. Selden closed the lid and praised the virtue of quiet rooms. Market days offered no reprieve. Butchers who had counted on half a coin now wrapped parcels for Emily's table while letting Grace wait in the aisle with kitchen girls. A milliner refused to mend an old hat for Grace, then crafted a feathered confection for Emily to honor her charitable season. The notary who had once bowed now showed her his turned shoulder. Richmond had decided who was solvent in the currency of reputation. She learned the house's altered hours, when the nursemaid paused by the nursery mantel to listen for gossip, when Mrs. Selden rehearsed phrases in the mirror, when Prowse arrived to consult in the blue parlor and left with receipts blooming from his breast pocket like a carnation. She learned the weight of doors and the way hinges were made to sigh when she approached. Most of all, she learned how easily a city that had nodded to her father's authority now nodded to the theatre of her disgrace. Yet she walked. Each morning she crossed the entry and laid her hand on the banister, carved with acanthus leaves, pressing a private vow into the wood. She did not argue when a door closed or a ledger vanished. Argument had been staged as the very symptom the guardians required. She noted instead names, dates, the angle of a seal on wax, the scent of cigar smoke on a paper that ought to have slept in her father's locked drawer. She studied which guests suddenly wore heirloom brooches that had gone missing. She kept her account in silence. So the mansion kept demonstrating its virtue, and the city kept praising the spectacle. And Grace, walking the same floors under new orders, discovered that humiliation, when recorded with care, could be converted into a ledger that tallied toward a reckoning. She counted humiliations, remembered names. The summer heat pressed down upon Richmond, war-wearied and yet desperate to display its refinement. In the Harper household, Emily perfected the art of piety staged as performance. Where Grace had once overseen household accounts with quiet precision, Emily transformed every ledger into a theatre script, and every guest into an audience. What the city witnessed was not the family's charity, but the careful weaponization of virtue against its rightful heir. It began with the so-called drives for Confederate widows. Invitations were written in Emily's fine looping hand, each sealed with Jonathan Harper's crest, though the signet had been taken from Grace's locked trunk. Boxes filled with coins and trinkets were displayed in the parlor before sympathetic visitors. What the guests did not see was the disappearance of jewels from the Harper vault pieces Emily carried. One by one, into the hands of the banker Nathaniel Prowse and the notary Elias Ward. Those jewels became the price of loyalty, exchanged not for relief to the needy, but for signatures and silence. The transactions were cloaked in the smell of candle wax and the rustle of petticoats. Emily would stand before her company, a candle held just so, and declare that every Harper treasure must serve the fallen. Guests, softened by sentiment, nodded with approval. Behind closed doors, Ward inked new receipts in Grace's name, documents that traced coin and silk, not to Emily's show of largesse, but to supposed extravagances by the elder sister. Each page bore the neat cruelty of forgery, an entry for fabric Grace had never seen, an expense for a coach she had never ridden, an indulgence for champagne she had never tasted. When Grace attempted to speak, her words were interpreted as the very illness they wished to prove. "Hysteria," whispered Mrs. Selden, pressing a damp cloth to Grace's wrist in front of the servants, as though kindness excused the insult. Emily repeated with solemn eyes that grief had unbalanced her sister. The narrative settled upon the city like dust after cavalry, covering everything it touched. To contradict was to prove them right. The machinery grew elaborate. Prowse summoned a lawyer who spoke of trusteeship, declaring that the estate required guardians until Grace demonstrated fitness. He hinted at the legal possibility of declaring her incapable of managing affairs, a ward of her own younger sister. Physicians were invited for tea, their stethoscopes gleaming like instruments of prophecy. Each nodded gravely and murmured about symptoms. Even servants were persuaded to join the play. A footman was bribed to say Grace wandered the halls at night, muttering at shadows, while a chambermaid swore she saw torn letters that proved dangerous obsessions. The papers mounted. Each week brought a new affidavit or receipt. Grace's attempts at refutation were torn as quickly as she produced them. When she requested to see the accounts, Emily gently laid a hand upon hers and told the guests that agitation had returned. When she rose to protest during dinner, a physician present remarked that her excited pulse confirmed their concerns. The spectacle of discipline had become a self-sustaining truth. Beyond the house, Richmond joined the chorus. A pastor praised Emily's sacrifices in his sermon, describing the donation of jewels as a lesson in humility. Merchants spoke of her prudence in settling accounts, even as they knew the coin came from pawned heirlooms. Rumors spread that Grace had embezzled from her own father's estate, that she hid gambling debts in trunks, that she had nearly ruined the family's name. The city, eager to believe in morality staged before them, applauded Emily's sternness and dismissed Grace as a tragic figure of feminine instability. The humiliation was relentless. Grace was summoned to sit in the back parlor while Emily displayed new charitable receipts, her name written across each as the donor. Guests turned to her with pity or contempt, expecting her to nod in guilty acknowledgement. When she shook her head, they whispered more loudly about her denial. On one occasion, the notary produced a bill of sale bearing Grace's signature, transferring ownership of 2 silver candelabra to a relief fund. She recognized the candelabra instantly. They stood upon the mantel in her father's study. But to point it out would be to accuse the guardians of theft, a charge the city would never believe from a woman already labeled unstable. Letters arrived that she had never written. One, addressed to a jeweler, promised payment for brooches and rings. Another, supposedly from her hand, requested credit at a shop in Petersburg. Both were read aloud at a family gathering, each word a blade pressed against her name. Servants exchanged glances of calculated sympathy, the kind that secured their places in the household's new order. Physicians scribbled notes in small ledgers, as if preparing the evidence for a commitment she had not yet been told of. The awareness came slowly, but with the weight of inevitability. Each scene rehearsed, each affidavit signed, each whisper rehearsed in salons was part of a structure built for a single conclusion: her removal. Emily meant to have her declared incompetent, locked away and erased. Grace would be turned into the family's cautionary tale, a name whispered with pity over tea, while Emily reigned unopposed over the Harper fortune. Grace did not allow tears. Instead, she learned to watch with the stillness of marble. She counted which servants had been bribed, which physicians were frequent callers, which neighbors repeated stories with too much precision. She began to trace the disappearance of objects, A necklace here, a miniature portrait there, marking where they reappeared, on whose collar or wrist. She studied the papers, even when denied their contents, catching glimpses of forged handwriting and unfamiliar seals. Every insult, every accusation became another entry in the ledger she now kept silently in her mind. She realized with chilling clarity that the courts would not save her. Judges bowed to bankers. Bankers answered to jewels. Physicians signed what they were paid to sign. Her protests would be interpreted as madness, her silence as guilt. The house was no longer her father's legacy, but a theatre designed to exile her. The next act, she knew, would end with her escorted from her own home under the veil of charity and medicine. In the lamplight of her diminished chamber, Grace began to gather scraps of paper, hidden away beneath floorboards and inside the hollow of a broken chair leg. She preserved letters her father had written, receipts with ink smudges that betrayed forgery, and notes about which guests wore jewels she recognized. She wrote with the patience of a clerk, her hand steady even when her heart was not. If the house had become a machine of punishment, she determined to learn its gears, one by one. And as she watched Emily's triumph in the drawing room, surrounded by praise and flattery, Grace no longer thought of justice as the world understood it. The courts, the pastors, the bankers, the notaries, none would ever rescue her. Justice had been stolen along with the jewels. Only one path remained: to reclaim power in the same cold, silent, final manner in which it had been used against her. She began with the arithmetic of theft. In the hush after midnight, Grace mapped the house in small, repeatable circuits. Corridor, study door, blue parlor, back stairs, the closet of linens where Emily kept her borrowed sanctity folded between lavender sachets. Each pass yielded some quiet figure she added to the ledger she kept in her head. One earring that should have had a twin. A miniature portrait stripped from its locket and set, indecently, into a ring on a visiting banker's hand. Traces of sealing wax on a drawer that ought never to have been opened. She did not confront, she measured. She learned how scandal moves. It wears perfume and writes receipts. Every discovery became a bead on a single cord. She did not tug, she collected. Guests who praised Emily's sacrifices appeared at church and salons, glittering with familiar things. Mrs. Cabell wore the sunburst brooch that had belonged to Grace's grandmother. The hinge, repaired badly, drooped like a tired eye. Mr. Drayton's wife sported a garnet pendant whose clasp bore a tiny nick Grace had made as a girl. Even the rector's spouse arrived with a narrow bracelet engraved with J.H., and explained that it had been found among donations. Everyone seemed to have rescued something from Grace's supposed excess, and everyone gleamed a little brighter for the rescue. She preserved fragments others overlooked. In the servants' hall, she rescued a scrap of blotting paper whose mirrored ink revealed a list of jewels and initialed buyers. In the pantry, a ribbon cut from a jewel case had been tied to a teacup, careless as a confession. Beneath the blue parlor rug, a faint smear of graphite traced where ledgers had been shifted and pressed to mimic age. Panic was the quality Emily wished displayed. Grace practiced its opposite. She learned the rhythm of locks, the hour when Mrs. Selden exhaled before sleep, the soft tread of the footman bribed to notice what he was told to see. She kept her note of it all in silence. By lamplight in her room, never fully dark, never safely hers, she copied her father's letters from memory and compared them to the forged addenda Emily waved at callers. The forgeries were competent but untrue. They used formal verbs her father disdained and misquoted the order of bequests. He had written the real will in a slanting hand that hurried as if going downhill, impatient with ornament. His signature always flattened in the flourish as the pen lifted. The false version imitated the shape, not the habit. The eye that loved him could not be tricked, so she stopped expecting rescue. Courts echoed bankers, pastors thanked donors, physicians climbed the steps smelling of bay rum and certainty. If she presented her ledger of observations, its scrupulousness would be called mania. She changed her questions. Not, how can I prove what was taken, but how does the machine of spectacle fail? Who pulls which lever, and what happens when a hand is removed? The supper that crowned the summer wore the face of courtesy and the bones of cruelty. Emily announced an evening for patrons of her widow's fund, a parade of donors who had purchased their own praises with Harper jewels. The blue parlour filled with lilies and speeches. The rector rehearsed an invocation in the hall. Nathaniel Prowse arranged place cards so the most obedient gossips could overhear one another's virtue. Servants circulated with champagne balanced on trembling wrists, the glass chiming softly as it kissed the rim. Grace moved among the guests like a draught, almost imperceptible, but shifting every candle flame. She noted which rings flashed, whose pendants glowed, which signatures were praised aloud. Emily, radiant and careful, kept her leather folio close, the one that never left her reach. Twice she touched it during laughter, the way a gambler taps a pocket. Grace caught the smallest flinch when Mrs. Selden murmured about the original paper and saw Emily's eyes blink too quickly. The folio was a decoy, the records waited elsewhere. When the musicians began their second reel, a maid fetched Emily with a message, whispered only for her. Emily, face composed, excused herself with a sigh that invited pity and slipped not to the retiring room, but down the side passage toward the records room that opened onto the half landing above the back stairs. Grace, seeming indifferent to drafts and talk, counted silently to 8 and followed at a distance that would read as coincidence. The records room had once held household arithmetic. Trunks lined with camphor, pigeonholes for rent rolls and field accounts, the narrow desk where the steward copied lists of barrels and bales. Now it held something sharper, a safe Mrs. Selden kept locked, and a trunk of family papers too heavy to lift without waking the stare. Emily's candle drew an amber thread down the corridor as she entered and shut the door behind her. Grace paused at the landing, one hand on the rail, measuring not the ethics of the moment. The house had finished teaching ethics, but the physics. The trunk at the threshold was ranked with others, oak sides banded with iron, its lid propped by a wedge too small for the weight. The hinge was tired. The stair that dropped from the half landing was steep, and the runner had not been nailed into every riser. She did not imagine outcomes. She recognized a single inclination, waiting for the faintest nudge. Inside, Emily moved papers with the care of a pianist rolling arpeggios. Folders slid. The safe door clicked. Grace heard the particular rustle she had listened for since spring, a sound like dry leaves in proportion, like her father's impatience pressed into skin. Emily murmured to herself, not prayer, merely counting. Then came a small gasp of triumph, followed almost immediately by the petty annoyance of practicality. Where to hide the thing during a supper built to worship secrecy? The wedge slipped because it had been poorly chosen. The lid fell, then halted. The trunk jolted forward a breath's width. Grace had not touched it. Earlier she had noticed how servants left it for later fastening, observed how a foot could nudge it in passing, how the runner's curled edge waited like a tongue. She stood where she stood, hand to the rail, a witness consenting to the house's own gravity. Emily opened the door with the parchment half tucked into her bodice. She saw Grace on the landing and misread that stillness as surrender. She lifted her chin and moved to step over the trunk. For a moment sister and sister shared the corridor's narrow air, the faint sweetness of lilies from the parlour, the odour of camphor and iron. Then the runner gave beneath Emily's heel, the wedge relaxed, the lid dropped in earnest, the trunk lunged. It struck bone and drove her backward. Her candle flared, guttered, and went out. Servants shouted. Someone laughed once from shock and stopped. Grace did not scream. She knelt only long enough to lift the parchment from Emily's bodice and fold it into her own sleeve. She closed the records room door, not to hide anything so much as to end the scene with the neatness the house demanded. On the landing below, a footman had dropped a tray. The crash disguised what had happened. Voices rose, then subsided. Habit, heavy as dust, resettled. Back in the blue parlour, she stepped into the light with a face composed by years of practice. When Prowse asked where Emily had gone, Grace said with the calm of accuracy that her sister needed a moment in the records room. It was true. The rector, confused by logistics, proposed beginning the invocation. The room, obedient to ritual, allowed itself to be shepherded. Afterward, while confusion ripened into calamity behind the scenes, Grace walked, never hurrying into her father's study. The key was not hers, the door was not meant to open. The desk drawers had been catalogued against her touch. Yet necessity teaches seams. She found the duplicate key Mrs. Selden had made and hidden in the false bottom of a darning box. She found the packet of forged notes bound with green thread and slipped them into the hearth. She turned each page of her father's ledgers until the figures matched the memory of his voice. Flames took the forgeries swiftly, as if eager to be rid of their own lies. She fed receipts and affidavits to the blaze, keeping only those whose ragged edges and half-legible dates might later be proof against their makers. In the firelight, the study's portraits shed their dust and watched. She placed the original will in the inner pocket of her bodice and smoothed her dress with a hand that no longer trembled. Downstairs, the gathering unravelled like a spool let go. Servants ran. Mrs. Selden faltered. The notary's silence expanded into an admission. Partners found reasons to leave by the side door. None of them could lead without Emily, and Emily could not rise. In the morning, newspapers would call it an unfortunate household accident and attribute the hush that fell upon the Harper house to poor health. Salons would whisper the other version, the one Grace meant them to learn without ever hearing it from her. By dusk the following day, the banker stopped sending cards. The notary misplaced his pen. The rector discovered a new text for his sermon. The jewels that had travelled the city began to vanish from wrists and throats, tucked into drawers by people who suddenly remembered provenance. The claque that had applauded Emily's discipline lost its conductor. Without the showrunner, the play collapsed. The mechanism shook once, twice, and fell still. Grace did not declare victory. She instructed the household with an economy of sentences, restored wages where they had been threatened, and left drawers closed that might have tempted a triumphant hand. She met the eyes of those who had watched her humiliation and offered them nothing except the usefulness of order. On the fourth evening she walked alone along the upstairs corridor and laid her palm on the carved banister, pressing into the wood a vow made not of anger but of shape. The house would hold its line. The family's branch that had depended upon Emily's marriage and her borrowed spectacle was already withering. Its leaves fell without ceremony, and the corridors remembered their proper mistress. She stood very still. Richmond awoke to whispers, not proclamations. The morning papers described an unfortunate accident in the Harper household, the sort of phrasing that suggested both delicacy and concealment. Poor health, one column declared, as if a trunk upon a stair had been no heavier than a fever. Tragic misstep, another offered, hinting at the precariousness of women's nerves. The truth, however, travelled by quieter routes through parlours and drawing rooms, across sewing circles and market stalls. There the story unfolded in fragments. A scream muffled by music, a candle extinguished. Emily Harper discovered where no heiress ought to fall. The partners who had feasted upon her ambition scattered quickly. Nathaniel Prowse, who had held her pledges in his breast pocket like Holy Writ, cancelled his calls to the Harper mansion and announced a sudden illness that confined him to bed. Elias Ward, notary of forged receipts and fabricated debts, misplaced his account books and declined all further association with the family. Servants who had once been bribed to notice Grace's supposed instability forgot their lines overnight. Without Emily to orchestrate the spectacle, their wages were safer under silence. The Harper mansion, which had for months been a theatre of humiliation, turned into a house of echoes. No longer did guests arrive to watch the elder sister paraded as unfit. No longer did ministers bless Emily's contrived sacrifices. The chandeliers, lit for charity balls, grew dusty. Neighbours remarked upon the sudden quiet, comparing it to a stage when the curtain has dropped and the audience has gone. In that quiet, Grace walked the corridors with a steadiness that needed no witnesses. She did not smile, nor did she seek vengeance from those who had abandoned her. Her authority lay not in declaration, but in the simple endurance of presence. The city, eager for tales of morality, reinterpreted events according to its need. Some whispered that Providence had struck down the scheming sister. Others, more cautious, said Grace had been spared disgrace by the mysterious workings of fate. Yet none spoke openly against her. The rumors of instability vanished as quickly as they had been spread. Physicians found their memories less precise. Servants discovered loyalty in their silence. Even the rector, who had praised Emily's sacrifices from the pulpit, now referred to the trials of Miss Grace Harper with a dignity that suggested long-standing respect. In private, salons recounted a different version. There, behind folded fans and half-emptied teacups, women whispered that Grace had triumphed with a composure few men could equal. They speculated upon forged wills destroyed, jewels reclaimed, accounts set right. No proof was offered, proof was unnecessary when the city craved stories that filled its evenings. What mattered was the shape of the tale, that greed had destroyed one sister and silence had preserved the other. The Harper name, once adorned with wealth and social promise, faltered in prestige. Emily's schemes had tethered the family's reputation to fragile alliances and ostentatious displays. With her sudden fall, those alliances crumbled. Suitors who had courted her favor withdrew. Bankers who had praised her prudence refused to recall the words. The branch of the family that had depended upon her marriage and patronage withered before it could take root. The dynasty, as the city called it, was judged by its collapse. Grace remained. She did not flaunt her restoration, nor did she seek to parade her survival. Instead, she resumed her father's routines, balancing ledgers at the desk in the study, inspecting accounts with meticulous care, walking the gardens at dusk as he once had. Servants, relieved by the return of order, obeyed her without hesitation. The mansion itself seemed to recognize its mistress. Doors no longer resisted her touch, corridors no longer bent toward her humiliation. Where once the house had been a machine of punishment, it now became a monument to endurance. Neighbors continued to gossip, but their tone shifted. Where they had once spoken of disgrace, they now spoke of solemn dignity. Grace was invited to teas, not as a spectacle, but as a presence. Women admired her restraint, men praised her composure, though none truly knew the silence that sustained her. She did not correct their assumptions. She allowed the legend to form, for legends served where justice had failed. Years later, the Harper mansion would be described as both a relic and a warning. Children whispered that its corridors were haunted by the fall of Emily Harper, while their mothers said it was haunted by the greed that had unmade her. Scholars pointed to it as a study in post-war inheritance disputes. But among the city's older families, the story was told more simply. One sister sought power through spectacle and lost. The other endured disgrace and emerged mistress of all. Grace herself gave no verdict aloud. Her silence was her judgment. She walked the corridors, held the keys her father had once entrusted, and carried the weight of a dynasty extinguished by its own ambition. The Harper name, tarnished in society, lived on only in her solitary stewardship. And the mansion stood, tall and solemn, a monument not to charity or piety, but to the way public disgrace and private greed had destroyed a generation, leaving behind only the survivor who learned to endure both without surrender.